So what are we going to talk about? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about AFPM. I'm going to talk about the internal combustion engine for just a minute, and then talk about what I was invited to talk about, which was a renewable fuel standard. Perennial favorite in our industry. AFPM was founded in 1902, before Standard Oil was broken up by the independent refiners in Pennsylvania. We have a long history, and we represent nearly 90% of U.S. refining capacity and nearly all the petrochemical manufacturing capacity in the U.S. All right, I wanted to start off just with a bigger picture on energy. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I love this chart. It's from the EPA, and it shows here trends over the last 45 years. You see their gross domestic product has grown tremendously, almost 300%. You've got vehicle miles traveled, you've got population, you've got energy consumption, and then the bottom two metrics there is the CO2 emissions, which have increased a little bit, but as a share of the economy, they're way, way down. And then you see the 6 common air pollutants there at the bottom that have decreased about 74%. So the bottom line point here is we've become a lot more prosperous and we've become a lot cleaner at the same time. And I do think our industry's played a role in that that I'll get into in just a minute. So sometimes you hear the internal combustion engine is over. You know, you see that on magazine covers all the time. Well, is it really true? Well, I spent last year, I see some familiar faces here, last year talking about that and warning, well, maybe this is a little too soon to write that obituary. And interestingly enough, electric vehicle sales in the United States and globally were down last year. So the march to the 100% EV future that we're told is there may not come to pass. The EIA has a projection that even in 2050, about 75% of sales will be the internal combustion engine. And that's probably a little bit that's maybe one of the outliers to some of the others, but almost everybody acknowledges that for decades to come, the internal combustion engine is going to be around. You know, it's certainly the most popular choice in America today with about 98% of sales. So with that as a given, the important part is to make sure that the internal combustion engine is meeting customers' needs and it's also as clean as it can be. And in fact, internal combustion engine vehicles today are clean and they're getting cleaner. This quote you see on the right-hand side, or this stat you see on the right-hand side is 99% cleaner than 1970 models. Imagine 99% cleaner. That is an amazing statistic that is not known. On the efficiency side, we have increased efficiency by roughly 30% just since 2004. And so I think this is a story that needs to be told, and it's both a function of the fuels industry and the automotive industry. On the fuels industry side, we have invested close to $100 billion just in the last decade or so in producing cleaner fuels. A lot of that has to do with desulfurization and different fuels. But also you have it on the auto side with more technologies introduced to try to meet efficiency demands while keeping consumer choice at the top. So I love this quote from Janet McCabe, who was in the EPA during the Obama administration. She pointed out that new cars, SUVs, pickup trucks, heavy-duty trucks, and buses are roughly 99% cleaner for common pollutants than 1970 models. We are driving more, but cars are getting more fuel efficient. People have more choices, whether they want a small car, an SUV, or a pickup truck. They can buy a zero-emission EV, a hybrid, or more efficient traditionally powered vehicles. And I think that's a good way to look at the internal combustion engine vehicle and the progress it's made and can make. So shifting gears a little bit here, wanted to get into some of the emission control programs in the United States. Just deal with transportation. I often hear it said when I'm up on the Hill talking with people or talking to the media that, well, transportation doesn't have any cap. There's no program that looks at transportation emissions, and it's actually not true. There's 3 very major ones. So you have the corporate average fuel economy or the mobile GHG requirements out of the EPA. That is directly a GHG program, as fuel efficiency and GHGs are basically synonymous. You have the zero emission vehicle program in California and 9 to 10 states, and you have the renewable fuel standard, which is the one we're going to spend most of our time on today. So, the RFS, Renewable Fuel Standard. This was began in 2005. I remember its birth well. I was actually working for Vice President Cheney in the Bush White House, and it was birthed in 2005 and then really supercharged in 2007. So in 2007 is where we got the volume requirements that are in the statute today. It was initially created to reduce American dependence on foreign oil, to promote rural development, and to reduce GHG emissions. And I think you can kind of see that in the three folks that were most critical in getting that legislation passed, with the president, who liked to emphasize the dependence on foreign oil, promoting rural development with Speaker Hastert, kind of had that bandwagon, and then reducing GHG emissions was kind of what Nancy Pelosi brought to the table in 2007 with the ESA, when it was dramatically increased. So the primary objective was to try to diversify fuel supplies. We'll get into that in just a minute, but first, why do refiners often get worked up about the renewable fuel standard? Well, it's because we are the obligated parties. We are the ones that at the end of the year have to turn in renewable identification numbers to the EPA to show that enough biofuel was blended into the country's gasoline supply. And why is that an issue? Well, this graphic tells you a little bit why. So we're the red circle there. That's your petrochemical, or your refining plants. We're in the middle of the stream here. So upstream, you've got from the wells all the way on the left side, all the way to the consumer on the right side. We're the folks that turn the crude oil into the products that you use every day. But before you buy them, it usually goes to somewhere in that, or it does go into that yellow circle. Some refineries do sell direct, but most goes to a terminal or to a distributor, and that's typically where biofuels are blended. And so the folks in the yellow circle are blending it. They obtain the RINs. And then by the end of the year, folks in the red circle have to buy the RINs and turn them back into EPA. We have petitioned the EPA for many years in a row to move the point of obligation of the program further downstream to those who are blending it. We think that makes a lot of sense for a reason I can get into if you want to see me afterwards at the cocktail reception. But for now, just suffice to say, it exercises our guys. For a lot of our refining members, they spend more on RINs than they pay their employees. It's, for a number of them, it's the number 2 cost in their operation outside of buying crude oil. That's why it's a big concern. All right, so going back to the RFS and the reasons why it was created, one of them was foreign oil dependence lessening. Here you see, as we all are very aware, it was the shale revolution that really helped this picture. And that line has actually crossed the 0 mark now. We are a net petroleum exporting country now. So in that sense, we've succeeded in that, although as you'll see, the Deputy Administrator of the EIA testified that it really wasn't the RFS that played a role in that. It was actually the production boom that played a role in that. The RFS did play perhaps a modest role, but not the driving factor. RFS had a goal, and that was to diversify the fuel of the United States. We had been producing ethanol in the United States for many years, and so that was not a surprise. But what they wanted to try to do is kickstart some of the cellulosic and next generation biofuels, and those just have not come to pass. So if you look at this chart, the statutory volume written in 2007 is on your first column there. Conventional biofuels, 15 billion gallons. Advanced was supposed to be 11, and cellulosic was supposed to be 7 billion gallons. Every year, EPA has had to waive those numbers, total, advanced, and cellulosic. And advanced they waive down to, a little more than a third, and cellulosic is really almost a rounding error of 288 million gallons compared to 7 billion gallons. And 97% of that is from biogas that's captured and then used in transportation. So the next generation cellulosic biofuels that President Bush talked about in terms of switchgrass and things of that nature just haven't developed in a commercially feasible manner. So it's really become a matter of conventional biofuels, including biodiesel. Biodiesel is an expensive component of diesel. It's typically about $1 a gallon more expensive than petroleum diesel. So it's not insignificant impact on the consumer. So conventional ethanol. This is where you hear a lot of the headlines in RFS discussions. And I'm going to talk about small refinery exemptions, which has been a big issue as well. We like to point out the facts of the gasoline market. And the facts of the gasoline market is that ethanol has a blend wall of 10% or so. Up to that point, it's pretty easy to blend ethanol into our gasoline supply. If you see this chart, this explains why this fact was considered, but the way that Congress did it is they just had volumes every year going out, and they took the AEO projection of what the total gasoline supply would be. That's that blue line that you see there, and it was supposed to go up to about 165 billion gallons by 2019. But lo and behold, with a lot more efficient vehicles in particular. In a slowing economy, particularly around the 2008 time frame, you see the red line, that's what actually happened. And then you see today's projections in that red dotted line. It's not going to hit that 165 billion gallons. So if you remember, ethanol had that 15 billion gallon volume requirement, which could have been met with 165 billion gallons without hitting that 10% blend wall. But if you're where we are today, which is about 143 billion gallons or so, you start to hit that 10%. And that's what makes the program really, really expensive. And the components of the blend wall are pretty simple to understand, really. It's primarily an infrastructure issue. So gasoline stations, about 50 to 60% of which are single station operators, have to prove to the EPA that their tanks can hold more than 10% ethanol without a risk of it leaking in their tanks. So a lot of those owners, maybe they've inherited an asset or they bought an asset, they just don't know. And to dig up the tank, to be able to harden it for above E10 is very expensive. It could be $180,000, $200,000 just so that they can sell a product that they're not sure there's a market for. That is one of the bigger impediments to it. Another big impediment is just vehicles. So I have a 2014 model vehicle. Right in my manual, it says not to fill up with anything more than 10% ethanol. And probably if you have a car before 2015, 2016, your manual probably says the same thing. Also, E15 is illegal to use in lawnmowers and other small engines by law. So there's just a number of infrastructure constraints, and a majority of the auto fleet today is still not warranted to use above E10. That's been what has been causing ethanol to not get that full 15 billion gallons. It hasn't been small refinery exemptions, which we're going to get into now. The small refinery exemptions has been in the media a lot. I know all of us with our various issues might like to be in front of the president about a dozen times in the last 18 months over RFS. It's not all it's cracked up to be, I can say. It is a difficult issue, and it's become very political. One of the kind of political footballs that came back and forth is the small refinery waivers. You can see in the left-hand chart that the number of waivers increased, in particular in 2017 and 2018. A lot of that was driven by court cases where the court slapped down the EPA for being overly stingy on the small refinery exemptions. We can talk about that again at the cocktail reception. But the reason why small refinery exemptions haven't had an impact is because they're typically granted far into the future. So, for example, it could be summer of 2019 is when the EPA granted waivers for the 2018 compliance year. So a refinery doesn't know if they're going to get an exemption. Even if they did know that they were going to get an exemption, they're still producing the same product, which is, going back to to my schematic here, they're selling downstream. They're selling what's called a BOB. They're selling a BOB that's not a finished gasoline product. It has to be blended typically with ethanol by the distributor, by the terminal, to get it up to the right octane level and so forth. They're going to be selling that product that's pretty much a commodity product. You're not even going to be able to get really a tariff on a pipeline in a lot of cases in order to change that and to try to turn it into finished gasoline. So even if they knew they were going to get an exemption, they're still selling the same product. And so all of that leads to the statistics, which are very clear from the EIA. This shows on the left-hand side the ethanol blend rate in gasoline. Again, it's right at about that 10% level. Easy to get E10. There's some people that do E15. There's a tiny bit of E85 that gets you to just a hair over 10%. And you've seen you saw the previous chart, 2017, 2018, there were more SREs, but the blend rate has continued to go up. The real story for ethanol it has been the reduction in exports, and that's the blue lines you see on the right-hand side. When China stopped importing ethanol from the United States, that was a big blow for our friends in the ethanol industry. And I do say friends. Our member companies are actually two of the top 5 producing ethanol companies in the United States are members of our trade association. They're all oil refiners. So it's not us versus them. It's really all together. We're in liquid fuels together. And so the statistics are telling the story that ethanol, there hasn't been that demand destruction that they've talked about. All right, so the 2020 rule, the small refinery exemptions played itself out in the 2020 rule. Primarily how it did that was the thought was, we know there's going to be some small refinery exemptions, so we're going to guess how many, and then we're going to reallocate that among the industry. As you can imagine, that's not a great position to be in if you're not an exempt refiner, because you, at the beginning of your compliance year, are told you've got to turn in this many RINs based on how many gallons you sell. And now, in addition, the EPA is saying, and we're going to put all the exempted gallons are going to be put on you. So you're essentially saying to part of the industry, you're exempt and everybody else has to, quote, make up the difference, even though, again, we don't think there's anything to make up. There definitely are RINs that will have to be returned, and that will affect the price of RINs, which affects the price of compliance. So we are, as we always do, we'll be suing on this rule, and courts will look at this. We're also suing on the E15 rule, you know, stay tuned for all of that. What I would love to do is just spend a couple minutes on a way past this. A way past this is a 95 RON octane standard. The way past this could be when Congress passed the renewable fuel standard, they had a 15-year running length of statutory volumes, and then in 2022, they hand the program over to EPA and say, based on these factors, you need to decide what volumes are appropriate. We don't like the idea of EPA having that much discretion. Our friends in the ethanol industry don't like the idea of EPA having that much discretion. It's not good government for a government agency to decide, to essentially plan what the fuel supply is, right? So we think a better solution would be to phase out the RFS and instead have a technology-neutral 95 RON octane standard. 95 RON is a step above what current regular is today, and it will give ethanol a chance to compete for additional gallons. So it would deliver about a 3 to 4% fuel efficiency gain because the automakers could have a higher compression engine, which would be more efficient. So that's what the autos get out of it. The carbon reductions would be equivalent to taking hundreds of thousands, perhaps as many as 720,000 vehicles off the road just from that efficiency gain. And I like to tell my friends who are more inclined toward an electrification route that no matter what you want to do with electrification, the internal combustion engine is going to be around a while. Why don't we work to make that more efficient? That's our story. We're sticking with it. So it could be sold over existing fueling infrastructure day one nationwide. Sometimes you hear other numbers. We heard 100 RON. We heard 98 RON a lot. You couldn't sell that in California is a big problem. And you would essentially force other fuels like an E20 if you got much above 95. We think 95 is a sweet spot and allows us to all compete for those octane for the customer. So very quickly, let me end on this. We think the 95 RON can benefit everyone. It's the lowest cost for the consumer. We worked for over a year and a half with the auto companies to try to find out what's the number two cost for a lot of refiners. And then lastly, ethanol is the cheapest source of octane just about out there out of anybody, and they'd be able to compete for more gallons. So we're going to continue to try to encourage this reform measure, and we are excited about the future of liquid fuels.